West African history, the transatlantic trade triangular trade. The transatlantic trade triangular trade. This was the trade carried out by the Europeans across the Atlantic Ocean involving the continents of Europe, Africa, and America. It majorly traded in slaves from West Africa and the commodities, like sugar, cotton, etc. from Europe. It was at times called the triangular trade because it connected the three continents of West Africa, Europe, and America. 3. Origin of transatlantic trade. The transatlantic slave trade began in 1441 by the Europeans. The Portuguese discovered the coast of the West Africa, who started trading with West African coasting slaves. The first cargo of 10 slaves was taken by a Portuguese explorer called Gonzales from West Africa to Lisbon in Portugal. At first, the volume of slaves was very small as they were taken for domestic use. Later, Spain in 1492 discovered Western Indies and America, which had vast land. There was need for slave labor due to the discovery of West Indies and America to work in the plantations of tobacco, cotton, sugarcane, etc. The native Red Indians were not enough to work in the mines and plantations in America. Therefore, West Africa was seen as the alternative source of labor. The Africans were strong and resistant to harsh conditions. In 1510, a large number of slaves were exported from Lisbon in Portugal to West Indies. By around 1540, the Lisbon, Portugal market was exporting to America more than 10.0 Negro slaves annually. West African history, the transatlantic trade triangular trade. The Europeans looked at the Africans as inferior race, and that increased the trade. In Africa, the chiefs and kings got slaves and took them to the coast of West Africa where they could be got by the European buyers before taking them to America and West Indies. Factors for the rise and development of transatlantic trade. The profitability of the trade led to its rise. Easy transport, i.e. development of steamship, facilitated the movement of Europeans to Africa. The willingness of the African chiefs and kings to trade due to their need of European goods. The development of armed conflicts in Africa increased raids for slaves and prisoners of war who were sold as slaves. The desire to acquire guns for expansion by the African chiefs. The growth of new and potential merchants class in Europe sponsored the trade. The need for slaves in the plantation farms in Africa led to its rise. The existence of domestic slaves who could be sold to get rid of undesirable elements in the society, i.e. thieves, robbers, etc. The industrial development led to the high demand for raw materials, i.e. sugarcane, tea, cotton, palm oil, etc. needed slaves to provide labor. The discovery of the New World, i.e. America and West Indies, by the Europeans led to its rise. The existence of strong states like Oyo, Dahomey, Asante, and Benin led to its rise. The fall of trans-Saharan trade led to its rise. West African history, the transatlantic trade triangular trade. The weakness were non-existent of labor in America and West Indies. Greed as African rulers wanted to accumulate wealth. Moral degeneration, i.e. slave dealers saw nothing wrong with the slave trade. Slave trade was also seen important to national strength for put trade national night. Organization of the transatlantic slave trade. It was organized in a triangular form involving 3 continents, i.e. Africa, Europe, and America. Initially, the trade was started and dominated by the Portuguese. Later, other countries like Britain, France, and Sweden, etc. joined the trade. The British later took over the trade from the Portuguese, who lost this position as the largest exporter of slaves from West Africa. Initially, slaves made up a small portion of the trade as commodities like gold, ivory, etc. were in great demand and more profitable. Ships sailed in 3 stages, i.e. first from Europe to West Africa and brought cheap goods, like knives, guns, liquor, clothes in exchange with Africans for slaves, gold, ivory, etc. The second was from West Africa to America and West Indies, where slaves were taken and sold to plantation owners to work on rubber, cotton, tobacco farms. Third was from America to West Indies to Europe with rice, rubber, etc. There were trading ports and centers at the coast, i.e. Port Novo, Illumina. West African history, the transatlantic trade triangular trade. Slaves were provided by African chiefs and middlemen who sold to European traders. Slaves were got through raiding prisoners of war. Some were domestic slaves and other criminals, i.e. thieves, robbers. The slaves brought from the interior were chained together and marched to the coast where they were sold to the Europeans. While waiting for the buyers, the slaves were kept in warehouses of compounds called barracan. Slaves were either sold in groups or single. The medium of exchange was barter trade as commodities from Europe were exchanged with those from West Africa. Later cowrie shells were introduced as money. Slaves were packed in crowded ships and taken to America, and the voyage took about 55 days. Many slaves died on the way due to harsh treatment by the Europeans, and those who became weak due to suffocation or fell sick were thrown in the water. Effects of the transatlantic slave trade led to endless wars in West Africa, i.e. the Sant and the Fount, led to misery, suffering due to slave raiding, led to depopulation of most parts of West Africa, led to introduction of new cultures. The trade delayed the introduction of cash crops in West Africa. The local industries declined due to slave trade. The local people lost trust in their chiefs. The Europeans continued looking at the Africans as backward class. Agriculture was put on a standstill due to wars of raiding. West African history, the transatlantic trade, triangular trade. The Africans tasted the European goods which looked superior, i.e. guns, clothes, etc. Led to the rise of some kingdoms, i.e. the Sant where some kingdoms collapsed in West Africa. It marked the beginning of the African colonization by the Europeans. Led to the building of ports which later developed into towns. Led to destabilization, i.e. tribes were mixed and broken up by the raids. Led to intermarriages which resulted in half-caste communities, i.e. Upper Guinea. There was widespread of insecurity as people lived in total fear for their lives. It affected development of West African economies as strong. People were taken as slaves. Legitimate trade was encouraged after the abolition of slave trade. The transatlantic slave trade led to the collapse of trans-Saharan trade. Moral degeneration as women and girls were raped. Led to emergency of trade in coastal states like Bonny, Brass and Opobo, etc. West Africa became known to outside world, i.e. in America. The abolition of slave trade in West Africa. Slave trade had far-reaching negative effects in Europe, America and Africa. This forced the Europeans to abolish slave trade and slavery during the 18th century and 19th century. Factors that led to the abolition of slave trade. The Industrial Revolution in Europe, i.e. England in 1650-1850, led to the abolition. The effects of American War of Independence/Revolution of West African history, the transatlantic trade, triangular trade. The increasing cost of slaves in America and Britain. The decreasing profitability of slaves. The writings of economists and philosophers like Adam Smith. The emergence of people of goodwill, i.e. William Wilberforce, Thomas Dark. The rise of humanitarian bodies or groups like the Christian organization who complained against the trade. The growth of European colonization in Africa. Population increase in Europe and America. The British Parliament by 1807 to campaign slave trade. The French Revolution of 1789 in France, which preached equality, fraternity and liberty of all men. The bad social behavior of slaves taken to Europe. America, i.e. thieves, led to the stopping. Steps taken to abolish slave trade in West Africa. The abolition of slavery and slave trade was spearheaded by Britain in 1772. The trade was declared illegal in England and all slaves who were working on plantations were set free in 1772 by Mansfield, who was the Lord Chief Justice of England. In 1787, a group of reformers who wanted change formed a Society for the Abolition of Slave Trade led by Granville Sharp. The other important people who condemned the practice of slave trade were William Wilberforce, Thomas Clarkson. Through public lectures, mass media, Anti-Slavery Committee was formed in 1807 and patrols put in the Atlantic Ocean to check on the slave smugglers. Sierra Leone and Liberia were founded as homes for resettling freed slaves from England, Jamaica and America. West African history, the transatlantic trade, triangular trade. Britain also built bains in Freetown and Fernando to effect the campaign against slave trade. Britain signed treaties with Spain and Portugal to ensure the end of slavery. Britain also signed treaties with African chiefs to end slavery, i.e. with Nomo Lumumba, Judge of Opobo, etc. By 1833, slavery was denounced according to the law. The slave owners were compensated. Missionaries greatly helped Britain in the struggle to stop slave trade as they preached the brotherhood, developed Western education which helped to stop slave trade. The Europeans later entered the interior of West Africa and built roads and railway lines used to transport goods instead of slaves, and by the 19th century, slave trade had almost stopped. The final blow to slave trade was European colonization of West Africa. Britain, France and Germany put an end to slave trade in the areas where they controlled. Effects of the abolition of slave trade on West Africa led to decline of some states that depended on slave trade, i.e. Wales, led to an employment of freed slaves. Increased European influence on the interior of West Africa. Many Europeans came to West Africa as settlers, missionaries. led to the colonization of West Africa by Britain, France and Germany, led to scramble and partition of Africa, led to the introduction of legitimate trade to replace slave trade. The population increased after the abolition of slave trade. Africans gained dignity and lived a settled life. West African history. The transatlantic trade triangular trade led to the development of modern towns like Lagos, Accra, and free towns. There was improved standards of living in West Africa, led to the foundation of Sierra Leone in 1792 and Liberia in 1822 as colonies for settling freed slaves, led to the rise of Negro race due to the intermarriages between the native Africans and the freed slaves, led to peace and security as slave trade was no more, led to the end of civil wars that were common in West Africa. Social services were established in West Africa, i.e. schools, hospitals. Trading companies were introduced like Royal Niger Company, led to exploitation of minerals in West Africa. Why slave trade lasted for so long, or why it was difficult to abolish slave trade. It was too profitable and therefore the participants never wanted to stop it. Some countries still wanted manual labour, i.e. Britain, Spain, USA, Portugal. Slave labour was cheap and therefore some people wanted it. Lack of substitute for slave trade made it difficult to stop it. Slave trade meant quick money by the sellers and crops that would take long before selling. African societies looked at slave trade as a way of removing wrongdoers in societies, i.e. thieves, murderers. Britain was first left alone to carry out the abolition, yet the area to cover was too big. Portugal and Spain had not yet industrialized and took long for them to accept the British idea of the abolition. Some traditionalists also resisted abolition because slaves were West African history. The transatlantic trade triangular trade, because America had just got independence from Britain, could not be disturbed. The long African coastal line also made the exercise take long. This was because Britain had few ships and manpower to patrol. The exercise was very expensive and needed enough money. Slave trade continued in the interior because the British were mostly at the coast, hence domestic slavery. Effects of legitimate trade in West Africa. Human dignity was restored. Two social classes emerged in West Africa, traders and the working class, led to the creation of large trading centres and stations, e.g. La Coudre, led to the exploitation of minerals and naturals, led to colonization of West Africa by European powers. The trade led to underdevelopment of Africa. It led to development of new communication lines like road railways, led to improvement in the standard of living due to